I am going to take you behind the velvet ropes of the most glamorous era in cinema, to show you the blood on the floor. In 1991, Michael Caine sat in his lavish Beverly Hills estate, surrounded by the spoils of absolute victory. He was a two-time Academy Award winner who had long buried the grim squalor of his London childhood under bespoke suits and million-dollar contracts. The public adored him as the ultimate British gentleman and a wealthy playboy with a charming smile. The magazines printed endless photographs of his yachts and his mansions. Then the phone rang. A reporter from a notorious tabloid called to shatter the golden illusion forever. The journalist did not ask about his next blockbuster film or his glamorous parties. The reporter asked about a crumbling psychiatric facility named Caine Hill Asylum. The reporter asked about a man named David Burchell. David was a severely disabled patient, locked behind the concrete walls of that decaying hospital for over 50 years. A worn leather visitor logbook sat hidden in the dusty archives of the asylum. That fragile book held the names and dates of a secret life. Caine listened to the voice on the phone in total silence. The global cinematic icon heard a name he had never known. The ghost of poverty had finally come to collect. Why did one of the most famous men on earth have a blood relative rotting in a psychiatric ward, completely erased from his own memory? The gutters of Southwark in the early 20th century bred disease and relentless starvation. The London slums were a factory of misery, where families froze to death in the shadows of the wealthy elite. The streets demanded a ruthless necessity to abandon the weak simply to survive the bitter winters. Ellen Micklewhite was a charwoman who scrubbed stone floors until her hands cracked and bled. She fought every single day to keep her family alive in a damp tenement with no central heating and no future. She also carried a devastating secret hidden behind a locked psychiatric door. Hunger is a vicious machine that strips away human dignity and forces desperate mothers to make impossible choices. Ellen gave birth to a boy with severe epilepsy in 1925. She named him David. Medical care for a disabled child required money that the family simply did not possess. The charity hospitals were overflowing, and the government provided no safety net for the working-class poor. Ellen faced a brutal reality: feed the strong or watch the entire family starve to death. The social system offered absolutely no mercy for the sick. David vanished into the cold walls of a state-run mental institution. He was thrown into a system designed to warehouse the forgotten and the broken. Ellen locked away her maternal grief and walked back into the freezing London fog to scrub more floors. She completely erased her firstborn son from the family history. She did this to protect the survival of the children who came after him. Maurice Micklewhite was born into this exact, suffocating silence. He would later change his name to Michael Caine and conquer Hollywood. The boy grew up shivering in rat-infested rooms while his mother carried the agonizing weight of a living ghost. The world sees a brilliant actor with a legendary cold stare. The truth is that stare was forged in the freezing rooms of a broken home where weakness meant absolute destruction. Poverty leaves a permanent scar on the human soul. The boy watched his mother work herself to the bone for pennies. He absorbed the terrifying lesson that security is an illusion, and ruin is always one missed paycheck away. The Korean War nearly broke him before Hollywood ever got the chance. He was a 19-year-old conscript sent to face waves of enemy soldiers in the freezing mud of a foreign valley. He survived artillery bombardments and close-quarters combat. He learned to detach his emotions completely just to pull the trigger and stay alive. He brought that profound trauma back to London. He carried the heavy burden of undiagnosed combat stress into his early acting career. He starved in tiny apartments. He worked dead-end jobs to fund his theater auditions. He faced constant rejection from upper-class producers who mocked his common accent. The establishment viewed him as street trash. He refused to give up. He allowed the anger to fuel his ambition. He weaponized his cold stare. He transformed his deep internal wounds into a compelling screen presence. The studios would eventually package this damaged veteran as a symbol of cool detachment. They sold his combat trauma as acting genius. They took his raw survival instinct and turned it into a commodity for global consumption. He escaped the slums through sheer willpower and endless compromise. He changed his accent and his name. He wore expensive clothes to hide the smell of the Southwark gutters. The public saw a rising star radiating effortless charm and supreme confidence. The reality was a terrified young man running desperately from the absolute destitution that swallowed his older brother. The shadow of Caine Hill Asylum loomed over every single decision he made, even though he did not yet know the name of the place. The hunger in his stomach drove him to accept any role and endure any humiliation. The Hollywood machine smelled his desperation from across the ocean. The studio executives knew exactly how to exploit a man who feared returning to the slums more than he feared death itself. They saw a handsome face hiding a broken spirit. They saw a worker willing to bleed for a chance at financial security. Survival demanded a total sacrifice of self. The journey from the London slums to the red carpets of Los Angeles required a complete surrender to a new kind of exploitation. The executives in their tailored suits recognized the hunger of a street dog. They knew that a man running from poverty will sign any paper and endure any abuse just to keep the ghost at bay. Michael Caine built a fortress of wealth and fame to protect himself from the cold. He bought the mansions and the cars to prove that the slums could never touch him again. He thought he had outrun the misery of Southwark. He thought his mother had successfully protected him from the ultimate cruelty of their social class. He was wrong. The past was patiently waiting in a leather-bound book inside a rotting hospital. To understand the crushing devastation of the phone call in 1991, we must first examine the industrial machine that built the false persona of Michael Caine. Stay to uncover the brutal contracts and hidden agonies that forged a global icon from the ashes of extreme poverty. The Hollywood machine is not a dream factory. It is a meat grinder disguised as a lottery ticket. The powerful executives at Embassy Pictures looked at the young actor and saw nothing but cheap labor. The notorious producer, Joseph E. Levine, despised the working-class roots of the young man. The directors heard his thick Cockney accent and nearly threw his casting profile into the garbage. They treated him like a peasant, begging for scraps at the table of the elite. Survival required total submission. Levine forced him to sign a draconian 7-year contract that locked him into a state of absolute financial servitude. The studio agreed to pay him a miserable £4,000 for a leading role in the massive historic epic Zulu. He signed the papers because starvation is a highly effective negotiator. The production flew him to the blazing African savannah. He arrived on the set carrying a deadly case of malaria combined with severe clinical malnutrition. The studio doctors completely ignored his violent fevers. The production schedule demanded 12-hour days in the blistering heat. He stood in front of the blinding lights, alongside the malaria rotting his blood, alongside the miserable £4,000 check that barely covered his debts, alongside the crushing weight of the 7-year trap. He smiled. He bled for the camera. He delivered the performance of a lifetime. The film became a massive blockbuster that generated millions of dollars for the executives sitting in their air-conditioned offices in Los Angeles. Levine's became exponentially richer. The young actor became a corporate asset. The media machine immediately went to work, spinning a massive lie to the American public. The press agents aggressively erased his traumatic past and his desperate poverty. They sold a fabricated image of an effortless British gentleman who drifted from exclusive parties to luxury yachts. The magazines printed endless features about his charm and his sophistication. They constructed a flawless, aristocratic facade. Behind the cameras, the reality was entirely different. The studio squeezed every drop of profit from his deteriorating physical health. They paraded him across talk shows and red carpets. He drank heavily to numb the physical exhaustion and the relentless anxiety of his fraudulent existence. The physical toll of the Zulu production nearly destroyed his body. The malaria caused brutal hallucinations and violent tremors in the middle of the night. He hid the sickness from the directors because a weak actor gets replaced and sent back to the slums. He swallowed his agony and put on the military uniform. The character required absolute stoicism and cold authority. He channeled the paralyzing fear of his own poverty into the icy stare of a British officer. The audience saw brilliant acting. The reality was a desperate man fighting to stay conscious while a tropical disease ravaged his internal organs. The camera captured his real physical agony, and the studio marketed it as dramatic intensity. The massive financial success of Zulu trapped him completely. The 7-year contract with Embassy Pictures turned into a golden cage. The executives forced him into back-to-back productions. They dictated his schedule and controlled his public appearances. He was terrified of losing the momentum. The ghost of the slums whispered in his ear every single day. The voice told him that the money could vanish tomorrow. The fear forced him to accept roles he hated and endure brutal working conditions. He became a machine designed to generate wealth for other men. The Hollywood press lauded his incredible work ethic. They had no idea he was running from a monster that never slept. The contrast between his public persona and his private hell was staggering. He attended film premieres in tailored tuxedos while fighting off severe panic attacks in the bathrooms. The Korean War had permanently rewired his nervous system. The sound of sudden loud noises on the film sets triggered violent flashbacks to the freezing trenches of the combat zone. He smelled the rotting flesh and the gunpowder. He forced himself to breathe slowly and walk back under the bright studio lights. The psychological pressure cooker required an enormous amount of alcohol to manage. The studio officers cleaned up his messes and ensured the newspapers only printed stories about his legendary charm. The system protected the asset at all costs. He bought the massive mansions on the Pacific coast. He purchased fleets of luxury cars. He threw lavish parties to prove to the world and to himself that the gutters of Southwark were gone forever. The money provided a desperate illusion of safety. The fame built a fortress around his fragile mind. He believed he had successfully outrun the generational curse of his family. The wealth accumulated rapidly. The bank accounts swelled with international box office returns. The actor moved his mother out of the damp tenements and bought her a proper house. He provided her with absolute financial security. He thought the money had finally cured the sickness of their past. He thought he had purchased peace. He had absolutely no idea what Ellen Micklewhite was doing every single Monday morning. The elderly woman maintained a silent and devastating weekly ritual. She left the comfortable home purchased by her famous son and took a long bus ride to the absolute edge of the city. She walked through the heavy iron gates of Caine Hill Asylum. The sprawling Victorian hospital was a grim warehouse for the discarded members of society. The hallways smelled of bleach and unwashed bodies. She walked into a crowded ward and sat beside a severely disabled man named David Burchell. She brought him small pieces of fruit and fresh clothes purchased with the pocket change she saved. She sat with him for hours. She wiped his face and held his hand. She carried the agonizing guilt of a mother who sacrificed one child to save the others. She never spoke a word of this to anyone. She walked back to the bus stop and returned to her comfortable life. She locked the secret away week after week. She endured this private torture for over 5 decades. In 1989, the brutal charade finally came to an end. Ellen Micklewhite closed her eyes and passed away. The funeral was a quiet and dignified affair. The actor stood by her grave and wept for the woman who had scrubbed floors until her hands bled to feed him. He delivered a beautiful eulogy. He buried her with the absolute certainty that he knew everything about her life. He believed their family had finally found rest. The mother took her darkest secret into the cold earth without uttering a single syllable of confession. She left no letters. She left no explanations. She left only silence. The death of the matriarch severed the final link to the slums. The actor believed the past was completely erased. The tragic reality was that the past was just waiting for the dirt to settle. The ghost of poverty had outlived the woman who tried to bury it. The ghost waited patiently in the damp archives of a forgotten hospital. The medical records and the visitor logbooks sat untouched in the dark. The ink faded, but the truth remained permanent. The Hollywood machine had successfully manufactured a flawless global icon. The machine had effectively erased the trauma of the Korean War and the humiliation of the Embassy Pictures contract. The machine could not erase a living human being locked inside a concrete cell. 2 years later, the tabloid reporters began digging into the crumbling records of the asylum. They found a name that matched the family tree. They found decades of signed visitor logs. They pieced together the devastating puzzle that a mother had desperately tried to destroy. The reporters prepared to drop a nuclear bomb on the flawless aristocratic facade of a cinematic legend. 2 years later, the tabloids dug up what the mother had buried. What did they find in the decaying records of the asylum? Leave a comment below. Does a miserable £4,000 check and a lifetime of studio exploitation justify abandoning a sick child to the cold machinery of a state hospital? The reporter from the People tabloid held the undeniable proof in his hands in 1991. He possessed the physical copies of the Caine Hill visitor logs. The faded ink on the brittle pages documented a horrifying reality that the Hollywood publicity machine could never sanitize. The name written on those pages was David Burchell. He was not a distant cousin or a forgotten friend. He was the firstborn son of Ellen Micklewhite. He was the older half-brother of the global superstar. A severe case of epilepsy in 1925 sealed his fate. A starving family in the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy could not afford his daily medical care. The charity wards refused to take him. The mother handed her damaged child over to the cold machinery of the state. She locked the heavy iron door. She threw away the key to ensure her other children could eat. The visitor logs revealed the true agonizing cost of their survival. Ellen did not simply abandon the boy and forget his face. She spent 50 years sneaking onto a public bus every single Monday morning to visit the sprawling psychiatric ward. She sat in the bleak hospital corridors, alongside the heavy scent of institutional bleach, alongside the screaming patients suffering in the dark, alongside the crushing guilt of a mother who chose which child would live and which child would rot in a cage. She bought him small pieces of clothing with the meager coins she saved from scrubbing filthy floors. She stroked his hair while he suffered violent seizures. She never told her famous son. She watched Michael Caine win his golden statues on a color television, while her firstborn son stared at a blank concrete wall. She carried this monstrous burden completely alone until her heart stopped beating. The public praised the actor for buying his mother a luxury home. They never knew she used that home as a base to visit a nightmare. Caine listened to the journalist explain the contents of the visitor logs. The telephone receiver felt incredibly heavy in his hand. The massive Beverly Hills estate suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. The aristocratic facade shattered instantly. He was no longer the confident British gentleman who charmed talk show hosts and commanded million-dollar salaries. He was Maurice Micklewhite again. He was the terrified boy from Southwark, standing face to face with the ghost of poverty. The revelation completely destroyed his understanding of his own life. Every single luxury he possessed was built on the foundation of a discarded brother. Every expensive meal he ate was paid for by the sacrifice of a boy locked in a state-run asylum. He hung up the phone. He immediately booked a flight to London. He prepared to face the physical manifestation of his darkest fear. The actor rushed through the heavy iron gates of Caine Hill Asylum. The Victorian architecture looked like a massive prison designed to swallow human souls. He walked into the exact same psychiatric ward his mother had visited in total secrecy for half a century. He finally looked at the face of a man who shared his blood. David was a fragile, elderly man who had spent his entire existence heavily medicated and isolated from the outside world. The brother did not know about the Academy Awards. The brother did not know about the massive, historic epic Zulu or the grueling 7-year contract with Embassy Pictures. He only knew the 4 walls of his crowded ward and the face of the mother who suddenly stopped visiting him 2 years ago. Caine opened his massive checkbook. He transferred his brother to a premium care facility. He hired the best private doctors and bought the most expensive medical treatments available in the country. He tried to weaponize the immense wealth of his Hollywood empire to fix a generational tragedy. Millions of dollars could not buy back 50 years of a stolen life. The attempt to save David was a desperate act of a violently guilty conscience. The human body can only endure so much institutional decay before the internal organs simply surrender to the abuse. David Burchell died in 1992. He spent less than 12 months experiencing the physical comfort his wealthy brother desperately tried to buy for him. The funeral was small and utterly devastating. The famous actor watched the casket descend into the fire. He realized that the relentless machine of poverty had ultimately won the war. The brutal economic system forced his mother to destroy a piece of her own soul just to feed him. The Hollywood studio machine then forced him to destroy his own identity just to escape the slums. They both paid a horrific psychological price for the glamorous illusion the public so desperately consumed. The survival of one son required the absolute destruction of the other. The ashes of David were quietly scattered alongside the ashes of Ellen. The mother and the discarded son were finally reunited in the cold, damp earth. The devastating secret was permanently laid to rest in the dirt. The public consumed the tragic tabloid story for a few weeks and then immediately demanded another entertaining blockbuster movie from their favorite star. The Hollywood machine wiped the blood off the floor and continued printing massive amounts of money. Caine walked back onto the film sets. He stood in front of the blinding studio lights and delivered his dialogue with flawless precision. He kept the dark reality buried deep inside his chest. He survived the machine. He beat the slums. The ultimate victory felt exactly like a crushing defeat. A worn leather visitor logbook now rests in the silent shadows of history. It sits far away from the flashing cameras and the exclusive red carpets. Picture that brittle, fragile book sitting directly next to a gleaming gold Academy Award. The shining statue represents the brilliant illusion of cinema. The decaying logbook represents the devastating truth of human survival. The golden idol required a literal human sacrifice. The machine built a legendary cinematic icon, but it completely destroyed David Burchell. Which side of the Hollywood dream is the actual truth? You have seen the blood hidden beneath the velvet ropes of the studio system. Subscribe to uncover the next dark secret that the golden era of cinema desperately tried to bury.